All right. The purpose of this short lecture is to talk a little bit about Pacific home fronts and specifically Hawaii. Because as a U.S. territory during the Second World War, I think it's something that we we tend to ignore because when it comes to thinking about uh, the conflict, we tend to maybe look at Pearl Harbor. That's about it, and then move across the Pacific and kind of look at the nature and pace of the war. Kind of as that went on, and so I think it's good, which is fine in many ways, but I think it's good for us to focus on Hawaii and what's going on there. So we're going to talk about a few dates and key themes and things for us to be aware of, be mindful of as we kind of contextualize and understand that the Hawaiian Islands have a really critical role to play in the process of Allied victory. And they have a very different, for those who lived there during the war, in many ways, they're going to have a very different experience than what many across the mainland U.S. Are going to have as well. So the first thing to point out is a couple of dates, all right? And these dates are before the Second World War, but they are critical to understanding the tenor and nature of the formation of the Hawaiian Islands politically as we know it by the time you get to World War II. And the first date is 1893, and the second date is 1898. Now, 1893 is the year that Queen Liliuokalani's government, and my apologies if I pronounced that incorrectly, is overthrown. And the process and that time period between 1893 and 1898, when Hawaii is annexed by the United States and becomes a U.S. territory within the next couple of years, is a difficult time period. It's a difficult process. So it's a time period in which those indigenous to the islands have their government overthrown. It is a time period in which you start to see a number of large-scale corporations begin to increase their holdings across Hawaii, with the intent being to transform the landscape to be able to meet production needs. It's a time period where the United States, after creating Hawaii as a territory, start to appoint territorial governors, begin to institute new territorial laws. There's a lot of complexities there. When it comes to the idea of plantations and the idea of the transformation of the Hawaiian Islands' economy for international export and that kind of thing, the big thing with a series of industrial producers will also be James Dole and the Dole Company and the role of pineapples, to the point where they're producing a large portion of much of the world's pineapples by the 1920s and 1930s. But the idea was, of course, that they wanted to bring in as many laborers as they could, really from across the Pacific. So you're going to have a number of white individuals, but you're going to have folks from the Philippines, from Japan, from really all over, who are going to make up a part of the Hawaiian Islands' population by the time you get to the era of World War II. And of course, these plantations are not exactly known for their kind and friendly business practices and labor treatment. So there's another character to this reality as well. A second thing to mention, of course, is Pearl Harbor. So that by the time you get to the end of the 1890s, right, the 1890s being a time where the United States is in many ways embracing the expansionist ethos of many other European nations. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, which comes to a conclusion with the Treaty of Paris at the end of 1898, the U.S. ends up with a number of new, what it calls, territories. Now, at the time, of course, this was a way for the United States to frame itself as certainly expanding, but not colonial. However, if we look at the tenor of the territorial governments and that kind of stuff, we're going to see some similarities to that idea of colonialism. And you're going to, of course, when it comes to more recent debates in historical scholarship, there's some work that tries to, kind of definitively argue that, but that's not for us to say right at this moment. Pearl Harbor, so at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, and the Hawaiian Islands, the United States, particularly the military, looks at it as a way to be able to project force across the Pacific. The U.S. was looking to be able to do this on a number of levels. America was directly inspired, certainly, by the writings of individuals like Alfred Thayer Mahan, and in this era of a global and industrialized arms race, especially in navies, the idea of putting naval bases and other bases across the islands, and especially a naval base at Pearl, was deemed as very attractive by the U.S. General Staff. So you're going to see a base put at Pearl between 1898 and 1899. You're going to, as well, see the tenor of both the Army and the Navy become more directly involved in installing and creating installations really around the islands in the years prior to 1941. Now, there has been a lot of scholarship, of course, on the choices of the Japanese and the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th. But, I think it's worth to mention here that even though the United States is creating a number of U.S. military installations across Pearl Harbor and across Hawaii at this point, that much of this planning, of course, was quite poor in terms of not really properly appreciating the potential for an attack that could happen. Race, of course, played a factor in this, just as much as race played a factor in the tenor of territorial government and relations throughout the 1930s as well. There was a fairly famous trial in Hawaii in 1931 known as the Thalia Massey trial, where this was a white woman who was the wife of a U.S. naval officer who claims that she was assaulted by a number of individuals who were not. They're put on trial. They're not necessarily found to be guilty, but then a number of them are beaten. Others do end up serving sentences. Some are even killed. So there's this real sense of racial difference and separation that is occurring, on the islands at this time. Now, in the late 1930s, so in the years kind of leading up to the attack at Pearl Harbor and leading up to the Japanese, operations really across the Pacific in early 1942, there was a growing concern on the part of some within the General Staff that decisions would need to be made and something would need to happen. So in 1940, the decision was made to move the U.S. Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor, that it would be seen as being able to project force more clearly. Now, for those who are aware, of course, that in some ways for the Japanese makes Pearl Harbor and Hawaii an even greater target during this particular period, although the carriers that they were looking to find in the morning of December 7th, they're not able to get to. The next thing that I think is really crucial to mention, the third thing to mention, is just kind of wartime and the idea of law and life, right? So how are individuals sort of treated here, right? So the Hawaiian territory, right, had a territorial governor, they had a territorial constitution, they had a territorial legislature. All of those, so the legislature and the constitution, they're suspended. And the territorial governor, basically, they abdicate, right? The territorial governors abdicate. And on December 7th, you're going to see an Army General Short basically declare himself to be a military governor and to instill martial law across the Hawaiian Islands. So pretty much from the moments after the attack, Hawaii is going to become, part of a war zone. It is part of a militarized war zone, and there's going to be a different level of experience and circumstances for individuals here. Blackouts and curfews and habeas corpus being restricted, right? All that stuff begins immediately. And for folks living in Hawaii, the first months after the attack, right, the process of recovering, right, because you had so many individuals, especially around in Oahu, around Pearl, who worked for the military. The process of recovery, right, that was a big part, which took a number of months. And then after that, the process of building up and kind of using Hawaii as this really sort of key base to project force in the Pacific, becomes a greater reality. So you start to see more tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers, kind of come into Hawaii and kind of project out from there. Something else to consider is general orders. So when it comes to thinking about a military government, when it comes to thinking about military governors, right? So they're going to issue a series of general orders that the public is going to have to adhere to. And if the public doesn't adhere to them, of course, there could be, in the military courts, which lasted for a couple of years, some fairly significant consequences. And really pretty much anything you can think of outside of just the general restrictions that existed across the mainland during World War II, all of that's going to extend to Hawaii, and for a very long time. I think for me, the idea that anyone on the Hawaiian Islands ages 6 and up is going to get fingerprinted, to me that's an indication of these are pretty strong restrictions. Now, the other thing really to center on with this and to mention with this is, of course, going to be the experience of Japanese Americans who are living on the Hawaiian Islands. Now, Japanese individuals were recruited, like many others were from across the Pacific, as laborers in a number of different industries and in farming communities and agricultural communities across the Hawaiian Islands by the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. And they'd achieved a varying series of positions of status, from working class to middle class and others. And they're nearly 30% of the population of the public in Hawaii by this point. It's something like around 160,000 people have Japanese ancestry across the islands at this point. Now, the reason this is important to mention is because, of course, of the terrible realities of the forced removal, the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans on the mainland, especially in the west coast of the United States, for most of the duration of the Second World War. This, of course, growing in the spring of 1942 after Executive Order 9066. Now, that process, of course, is a whole other separate conversation, but there's quite a great deal of scholarship that makes it abundantly clear that a lot of that was not motivated by the idea of security, but is motivated more on race and has to do with internal politics in California and other considerations. The Japanese Americans and those of Japanese ancestry on the Hawaiian Islands, during the Second World War, are not part. They're not part of Executive Order 9066. They're not part of that removal. However, that doesn't mean that a climate of fear did not exist for those of Japanese ancestry across the islands. It doesn't mean that there weren't individuals who were detained, because there were. It's something like at least 2,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry across the Hawaiian Islands are going to be detained. And a number of these individuals are also going to be sent back to the U.S., back to the mainland, for further detention. If you were an individual of Japanese ancestry living in the Hawaiian Islands, kind of as the Second World War is getting going, you experienced, of course, great discrimination in many cases. They would have experienced great fear, and they would have experienced this view of a need or necessity to very strongly, very outwardly display patriotism as a way of needing to prove worth. And so you see, very, very publicly these Japanese American communities in Hawaii, donating blood, volunteering in a wide variety of territorial programming for mobilization for the war. You see a number of young people volunteering for sort of work details. You have a number of Japanese Americans who are involved across the universities in Hawaii, joining ROTC. Some of them are going to eventually become involved in the 442nd, the Regimental Combat Team, which was made up entirely of Japanese Americans. So it's not a good history, but it's a part of the process that individuals experienced during that particular time. When it comes to, kind of then thinking about Hawaii, so you've got, these issues of imperial action, right? You've got this issue of brutality against local populations. You've got racialization. You've got militarization. You've got a a wartime state that structures its authority differently, right? So, given that individuals of Japanese ancestry were so much part of the population in Hawaii, it would have, from an economic standpoint, been very difficult for the war effort to incarcerate, to bring into internment camps so many individuals. And so the military is not willing to do that in Hawaii. But again, that climate of fear predominated. All right. Thanks so much.